The year was 1907, and the woods around Hollow carried a kind of silence that made people pause before stepping into them. The trees were old, thick, and stubborn, packed so close together that sunlight slipped through only in weak strips. In the day, the forest looked calm, almost comforting if someone didn't stare too long at the shadows between the trunks. But at dusk, something changed. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the woods remembered things people chose to forget. Locals respected the forest the way a person respects a wounded animal, quietly, carefully, and never for too long. Yet hunters still wandered into it, drawn by the deer population and the thrill of the chase, believing skill and confidence could protect them from whatever stories the townspeople shared in low voices. People in the nearby village liked to say the woods behaved differently depending on who walked inside. Some swore that a deep fog showed up only for certain men. Others said the forest watched people, following them deeper without them knowing. Most dismissed these tales as old country superstition brought over by families who didn't let go of their past fears. Even so, the older men, the ones who had seen too much, always warned newcomers to leave the forest before the sky turned orange. The hunter at the center of this story had heard those warnings too, but like many before him, he believed he understood nature better than the people who lived beside it all their lives. Before everything happened, he lived a life that appeared simple from the outside. He was strong, quiet, and often alone, but not lonely. He hunted mostly for trade, not sport, and many families depended on the meat he brought back during harsh months. He carried himself like someone used to hard work and long days. He didn't seem troubled, and no one would have guessed that a man like him could walk straight into a nightmare he didn't see coming. Still, there were small signs that something inside him had been shifting for a while. He had begun spending more hours in the woods than he needed to, staying out later than he used to. When people asked why, he only said the forest felt calmer than the town. Some believed him, others wondered what he was escaping. Around that same time, there were quiet rumors about a strange family living deep inside Hollow, a family no one ever saw in the village. The people called them, though no one knew if that was their real name. A few woodcutters claimed they had seen lights moving through the trees where no one should have been living. Another man, half drunk and half scared, once said he heard children laughing somewhere in the woods at dusk, but there were no children who lived that far out. People whispered about these stories but never spoke them out loud in daylight. Something about the tales felt dangerous, like the forest might hear and punish them for talking too much. The hunter had heard these stories too, but he never shared his thoughts on them. He simply packed his gear, checked his rifle, and walked into the forest as if the trees were old friends. Maybe he felt safer in nature than around people. Maybe the quiet of the woods dulled whatever worries he kept hidden. It didn't matter at the time, because no one suspected that his growing attachment to the forest would pull him toward something far more troubling than loneliness. The day he disappeared began like any other. The sun rose pale and soft, the kind of morning that made everything look washed out. A light mist sat over the ground, curling around his boots as he walked. The village felt peaceful. Children chased each other in front of the bakery. A group of men argued about lumber prices the way they did every week. Women carried baskets of bread, gossiping about harmless things. Nothing felt unusual. No one sensed any danger. If anything, life looked almost too calm, like the world was taking a deep breath before something went wrong. The hunter passed through the village with his usual nods and quiet greetings, giving no hint of what he was thinking. But if someone had watched him closely, they might have noticed the way his eyes drifted toward the dark tree line at the edge of town, almost as if it was calling him. He didn't hurry, but there was a certain pull in his steps, a quiet urgency he didn't show on his face. People assumed he was just eager to find a good hunting spot before others scared off the game. It was normal enough. Yet something about that morning felt slightly off to those who paid attention, like a soft warning no one could put into words. At that same moment, far from sight, the family moved through their part of the forest in complete silence. They didn't leave their land often, and when they did, it was always at dusk. Some believed they were reclusive farmers. Others swore they were something darker, something that didn't follow the same rules as the rest of the world. Whatever the truth was, the family carried an air of secrecy and control. The way they kept to themselves made people uneasy. There had been stories of missing animals, strange sounds, and footprints that didn't match any known creature. No one ever confirmed them, but their presence hung over the woods like a shadow. The hunter didn't know it yet, but his path and theirs were already quietly moving toward each other. The lives of everyone involved looked normal on the surface, yet each held threads of tension waiting to snap. The hunter's growing detachment, the village's unspoken fears, the family's hidden world. All of it was forming an invisible line pulling him deeper into something he could never walk back from. And as he stepped into the forest that morning, the sky still bright and gentle, the air shifted in a way too subtle for him to notice. The trees leaned in, the wind slowed, and something unseen watched him cross the point where the safe path ended. He didn't look back. He didn't think he needed to. But the world he left behind was already fading, and the one waiting ahead of him was nothing like the stories he had heard. It was darker, stranger, and far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The deeper the hunter walked into the woods that day, the more the world around him seemed to close in. At first, everything felt normal enough. The crunch of twigs under his boots, the distant calls of birds, the soft whistle of wind slipping through the branches. But as the sun rose higher, the forest began to feel strangely still. He had been in these woods countless times, yet something about the quiet pressed on him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, but more like the absence of it. He kept glancing over his shoulder, thinking he had heard footsteps behind him, only to find nothing there. He pushed the feeling aside. Long trips in the woods could play tricks on a man, especially when he walked alone. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that something in the forest had changed. The air felt heavier, the light dimmer, even though the sky was clear. He tried focusing on the hunt. He followed a trail of deer tracks, checked the wind, and kept his rifle ready. But now and then he caught a flicker of movement between the trees, a quick shift of shadow that didn't belong to any animal he knew. The first real sign that something was wrong showed itself near a stream he had visited many times before. The water there usually ran clean and quick, but today it moved slowly and cloudily as if stirred up from below. On the bank he noticed footprints. At first he thought they were his own or maybe those of another hunter. But the shape wasn't right. They looked almost like human prints, but wider, deeper, as if whoever left them was heavier than they should have been. And there were too many of them, far more than a single person would make. They circled the area as though someone had been packing back and forth, waiting. He crouched, studying the prints with a sinking feeling. Someone had been close. Someone who didn't mind leaving marks in a place few people visited. He scanned the trees around him, expecting to see another hunter stepping out with a friendly wave, but the woods stayed empty. The silence grew around him, like a rope pulling in from all sides. He should have turned back. A small voice in his mind whispered that something here wasn't safe. But he had never liked the idea of fear controlling him. He stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and kept moving deeper. As the hours passed, tension built inside him, not sharp but steady, like a slow tightening in his chest. The woods no longer felt like the quiet refuge he once loved. Everything looked too still, too watchful. Trees stood at strange angles, leaning over him as if listening. He tried to quicken his pace, but no matter how far he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him from behind. Then near midday, he found something that made him stop cold. A small leather pouch lay half buried in the leaves, the kind a child might carry to hold stones or berries. But it wasn't the pouch itself that unsettled him, it was what was inside. He opened it slowly, expecting to find harmless forest clutter. Instead, he saw tiny bones. Clean, smooth, arranged carefully in a pattern he didn't understand. They weren't from any animal he knew. Something about the way they were tied together with thin strips of fabric felt wrong. Too precise, too intentional. His stomach tightened. This wasn't the work of another hunter. This was something else, something connected to the strange family people whispered about. He had never seen them, but he suddenly felt as if they had been closer to him than he ever imagined. He stuffed the pouch into his coat, telling himself it was better to bring it back to the village, show someone, ask questions. But another part of him, a quieter and more frightened part, wondered if picking it up had been a mistake. As he continued, the light in the forest dimmed even though the sun hadn't begun to set. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. The air cooled. The trail beneath his boots felt unfamiliar, even though he had walked it many times. He kept pushing forward, trying to convince himself that he wasn't lost, that he simply needed to head east a little more. But with each step, the woods grew stranger, twisting paths where none had been before, breaking the lines of memory he depended on. By late afternoon, he reached a part of the forest he had never seen. The ground dipped into a shallow valley, and in its center sat an old wooden fence, broken in places but still standing enough to mark the edges of private land. The boards were dark with age, some covered in moss. Inside the fence, wildflowers grew in uneven patches, mixed with tall weeds and stray stones that looked like the remains of forgotten graves. He felt a pressure in his chest as he stepped closer. He had heard rumors of a homestead deep in the woods, a place where the family lived far from the town. No one had ever seen it. No one had dared to look. People said the family didn't welcome visitors, and anyone who wandered too close was met with silence if they returned at all. He had never believed those stories. Now, staring at the fence, he wasn't so sure. A narrow path cut through the flowers toward a clearing further ahead. Smoke rose faintly from somewhere beyond the trees, thin and pale like the last breath of a dying fire. It was the first sign of people he had seen all day. His instincts warred with each other. Part of him knew he shouldn't be here. Another part believed he needed help, directions, information, anything to steady the unease growing inside him. The choice was made for him when he heard soft laughter drifting through the trees. Children! The sound was faint, distant, and so out of place that it struck him like a blow. No children lived out here. None should have been anywhere near this part of the woods. The laughter didn't sound playful either. It was sharp, repeating the same rise and fall, almost rehearsed. The hunter froze, his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to call out, ask if someone needed help, but something in that laughter told him to stay silent. He followed the sound slowly, carefully stepping over roots and branches. As he walked, the laughter faded, replaced by low murmurs, voices he couldn't make out. They seemed to move in circles around him, shifting from one side to the other. He felt dizzy, unable to pinpoint their source. When he finally stepped into the clearing, the world changed all at once. An old house stood in front of him, worn but upright, its windows dark, its roof patched with mismatched boards. Smoke trickled from a crooked chimney. A clothesline hung near the side of the house, covered with small garments that looked handmade. The house wasn't abandoned. It was lived in. He had found the... Before he could take a step back, a figure appeared on the porch, a tall man with broad shoulders, long hair, and eyes that didn't blink. His clothes were old-fashioned, rough, and patched. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply watched the hunter like someone studying an intruder. "You're far from home," the man said softly, his voice strangely calm. The hunter swallowed. "Think I lost my way." "You think," the man repeated, tilting his head. The hunter sensed something wrong beneath the man's quiet tone. A heavy energy clung to him, the kind that made a person want to run even before danger showed itself. But the hunter forced himself to stay still. Fear in unfamiliar places often made things worse. "I didn't mean to trespass," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just need to find the path back to the village." The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head toward the woods behind the hunter, as if checking whether something or someone stood there. Only after a long moment did he speak. "You should come inside," he said. "Dusk is close. These woods don't stay safe at night." The hunter hesitated. He didn't trust the man. Every instinct inside him screamed that stepping inside that house would be dangerous. But he also knew he was lost, truly lost, and the dark would fall soon. The temperature had already begun to drop. If he wandered blindly, he could freeze before morning. As he struggled with the decision, two children stepped onto the porch. A boy and a girl, both pale, both silent. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, watching him the same way the man did. They didn't smile. They didn't look curious. They simply stared. Something in their blank expressions made the hunter's skin prickle. Children usually held some kind of life in their faces, joy, fear, mischief, anything. But these two looked hollow, like they had been taught to hide every emotion. Still, the man's offer lingered. Shelter, a fire, a chance to gather himself. He took one slow step forward. Inside the house, the air felt heavier than outside. The rooms were dim, lit only by weak candlelight. The smell of something boiling, herbs, maybe hung in the air. The hunter took everything in quietly, noticing the odd details. Jars lining the shelves, filled with plants he couldn't name. A long table covered with strange carvings. A woven rug with patterns that didn't match any design he had ever seen. The man closed the door behind him with a firm click. And for the first time, the hunter felt truly trapped. As they sat at the table, the man introduced himself simply as Elias. He asked a few questions, spoke even fewer words, and watched the hunter with eyes that never softened. The children sat at the far end of the room, whispering to each other in voices too low to hear. The hunter noticed that their clothes matched the fabric tied around the bones he had found earlier. His heart pounded harder. He forced himself to stay calm. Elias finally asked, "Why were you so deep in the woods?" Before the hunter could answer, Elias leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "People don't come here by accident." The hunter's grip tightened on the edge of the table. He needed to choose his words carefully. He needed to hide the pouch he had taken. He needed to find a way out. As he explained his story in the simplest way he could, he saw something shift in Elia's face, not anger but suspicion. A sharp, silent tension filled the room, as if the air itself was waiting for someone to make a wrong move. Outside pressures tightened around him. Inside, the cold stares cornered him. Conflicting instincts twisted inside his chest, fear, pride, desperation. This was no longer a simple hunting trip gone wrong. This was something far more dangerous. And as the last light of day faded from the windows, the hunter realized he wasn't sitting with a family hiding from the world. He was sitting with a family hiding something else entirely, and they weren't about to let him walk away. The night would bring out their true nature, and his fight to survive had only just begun. Night had settled thickly over the house by the time the hunter realized he wasn't just lost, he was trapped. The candles flickered weakly, casting strange shadows that crawled across the walls. The family moved around the rooms with silent purpose, their footsteps soft but deliberate, like people preparing for something they had done before. Every sound felt sharper, louder, even the crack of wood in the fireplace made the hunter jump. His senses were stretched thin, ready to snap. He tried to stay calm, watching Elias closely while pretending not to. The man moved with unsettling patience, his eyes cutting toward the hunter every few seconds. The children sat on the floor nearby, whispering in their low, practiced voices. He still couldn't hear the words, but the rhythm of their whispers felt wrong, too steady, too rehearsed. The girl would tilt her head every now and then as if she could hear something no one else did. The hunter's heart pushed against his ribs. He needed to leave. Every part of him screamed it. But the door was locked, the windows nailed shut, and Elias stood too close for escape. The hunter ran a thumb over the little pouch of bones in his pocket. He didn't know why he hadn't thrown it away yet. He only knew that revealing he had it could make things much worse. The moment the tension snapped came quietly, almost unnoticed at first. It began with Elias standing from his chair. He didn't make a sound. He simply straightened, stretching his broad shoulders as if preparing himself. His face held no emotion, but his eyes had changed. They were colder, darker, fixed on the hunter like a man studying a frightened animal. "You shouldn't have come here," Elias said softly, "and you shouldn't have touched what wasn't yours." The hunter froze. He hadn't mentioned the pouch, he hadn't shown it, but Elias somehow knew. The children rose to their feet as if responding to a signal only they heard. Their eyes remained wide, empty, waiting. The hunter reached slowly for his coat, pretending he was adjusting it. In reality, he was searching for the knife he kept inside. His fingers brushed the handle, but before he could grip it, Elias took a step forward. "You brought something with you," Elias murmured. "Give it to me." The hunter's throat tightened. He pulled his hand back from the knife, knowing any sudden move would set things off too soon. "I don't know what you mean." Elias tilted his head, his jaw tensing. "You know exactly what I mean." The boy stepped forward suddenly, and the hunter instinctively took a step back. The tension broke like glass. "Stay away," the hunter snapped. Elias' expression hardened. "You shouldn't raise your voice in this house." The hunter couldn't help it. Fear pushed his pulse into panic. His hand shot into his coat. Elias lunged at the same moment. The hunter pulled the knife free, and everything happened fast. Elias grabbed the hunter's arm, slamming it against the table so hard that the knife nearly flew from his hand. The children screamed, not in fear, but in a strange, eager excitement that made the hairs stand on the back of his neck. The hunter fought against Elias' grip with everything he had, his muscles burning as the knife trembled dangerously between them. The house seemed to close in. The candles flickered wildly, shadows twisting across the walls like dark figures circling them. Elias was stronger, much stronger than the hunter expected. The man's breath hit the hunter's face, hot, steady, unshaken. There was no fear in him, no hesitation, only cold purpose. "You don't belong here," Elias hissed. The hunter's grip tightened on the knife. He twisted, using the little space he had to pull his arm free. Elias lunged again, reaching for his throat. The hunter reacted without thinking. He drove the knife forward. The blade sank into Elias' chest. For a moment, everything froze. Elias stared down at the handle sticking out of his body, his eyes wide, not in pain, but in confusion, as if he couldn't understand how the hunter had dared to fight back. The hunter stumbled away, trembling, breath tearing from his chest. The children's screams shifted into something else. They rushed to Elias' side, but he didn't fall immediately. He staggered once, gripping the table for support. His breath turned ragged, a deep, choking sound filling the air. When he lifted his head, his eyes burned with fury. "You've made a grave mistake," he whispered. Then he collapsed. The hunter stood frozen, his knife slick with blood, his chest heaving. He had expected Elias to go down like any man stabbed in the heart, but something about the way Elias hit the floor didn't feel right. His body didn't loosen. It didn't slump. It stayed tense, coiled, almost as if still alive. The boy's small hands pressed against Elias' chest, smearing blood across his palms. The girl dropped to her knees beside him, her voice rising in high-pitched cries that echoed through the room. The hunter's ears rang. His body shook uncontrollably. He didn't know if he had meant to kill Elias. He didn't know if he had a choice. Fear and shock battled inside him. He backed toward the door. He needed to escape before the children attacked him, before Elias rose again, before the rest of the family returned, if there were more of them hiding somewhere in the shadows. But the children didn't lunge at him. They didn't scream at him. They didn't try to block his path. Instead, they stared at him with hollow, grieving eyes. "You weren't supposed to do that," the girl whispered. Her words made the blood in his veins turn cold. The boy stood slowly, his fists trembling, tears streaked down his pale cheeks. "He wasn't finished with you." The hunter's breath caught. What do you mean?" Neither child answered. They turned their faces back to Elias, pressing close to his unmoving body. Their shoulders shook with silent sobs, but the hunter got the unsettling sense that the grief wasn't for Elias dying. It was for something far worse about to happen next. A deep crack echoed from somewhere beneath the floorboards. The hunter's head snapped toward the sound. Another crack, louder this time, like wood splitting under weight. The children backed away from Elias, their eyes fixed on the floor. They didn't speak. They didn't move. Their small chests rose and fell in sharp, panicked breaths. Suddenly, the boards beneath Elias' body shifted. A low groan rumbled through the house, vibrating under the hunter's feet. The candles sputtered. The air grew colder. "No," the girl whispered. "No, no, no." Something beneath the house was moving. Panic ripped through the hunter's chest. He grabbed the nearest chair, ready to swing it at whatever was coming. His breaths came fast and uneven. The children pressed against the wall, covering their ears. The floorboards bulged upward. The hunter stumbled back as a long, dark hand pushed through the wood, skeletal, twisted, with fingers too long to be human. Another crack followed, then another, until the boards snapped apart entirely. A figure rose from the darkness beneath the house, dragging itself into the room with slow, sickening movements. The hunter's blood froze. It wasn't Elias. It wasn't anything human. Its face was long and pale, its eyes sunken and black. Strands of dark hair clung to its gaunt skull. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that made the hunter's stomach churn. It crawled toward Elias' body, its breath rattling like something struggling to stay alive, or something that had died long ago. The children didn't scream. They simply stared, their tears drying on their cheeks. "Father," the boy whispered. The creature placed one long hand on Elias' chest, its fingers trembling as if searching for a heartbeat. The hunter backed toward the door again, shaking uncontrollably. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee into the night, no matter what waited outside. But he couldn't move. His legs refused to respond. The creature slowly lifted its head, its dark eyes locking onto the hunter. In that moment, the hunter knew he had walked into something ancient, something that fed on fear, something the family had guarded for generations. Elias hadn't been the true danger. This thing, the thing crawling out from beneath the house, was. With a sudden jolt, the creature let out a sound that shook the walls, a deep, guttural cry of rage and hunger. The children covered their ears. The candles blew out. The hunter dropped the chair and bolted toward the door, kicking it open with all his strength. The cold night swallowed him whole as he ran, crashing through the woods with nothing but terror guiding him. Behind him, the cries of the children rose into the night, fearful, grief-stricken, and somehow pleading, followed by the inhuman wail of the creature that had risen from beneath their home. The hunter didn't look back. He couldn't. He ran until his lungs burned, until the trees blurred around him, until the world felt like one long, desperate sprint for survival. But even as he fled, he knew the forest was alive with the sound of something following him. something that wouldn't let him go. The forest did not let him go easily. Long after the hunter escaped the house, he could still hear the branches snapping behind him as if something moved just out of sight. He ran until his legs shook and his breath tore painfully through his chest. Why he collapsed beside a fallen tree, unable to take another step. The night air felt colder than he had ever known, and every sound in the dark made him flinch. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even wipe the blood from his knife. Elias' blood. He hadn't meant to kill him, not really. Everything had happened too fast, but the guilt climbed inside him all the same, settling deep and heavy. He kept whispering to himself that he had no choice, that it was him or Elias, that any man would have fought back in the same situation. But the words didn't soothe him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elias' expression when the knife went in, not angry, not terrified, just shocked, like he couldn't believe someone had finally dared to strike him. And behind that image, the creature's face hovered, the long, pale features, the black eyes that held too much hunger to be human. By the time the sky began to lighten, the hunter forced himself back onto his feet. The forest felt a little safer in the dawn, but the fear still stuck to him. He made his way toward the village, stumbling through frost-covered brush. Every shadow made his heart jump. Every crow's call sounded like a warning. When he reached the outskirts of the village, people stared. He must have looked half wild, clothes torn, face scratched from branches, blood dried on his hands and sleeves. A few residents took cautious steps toward him, asking if he was hurt, but he couldn't speak. The words tangled in his throat. He simply nodded and let them guide him toward help. Word spread fast. By noon, the entire town knew he had returned from the woods in terrible shape. They whispered about what he might have seen, what might have happened. Some blamed a wild animal. Others spoke of getting lost and freezing overnight. No one imagined anything close to the truth. When he finally found the strength to talk, he tried explaining what happened, that he had been taken into a strange house, that Elias had attacked him, that he had acted in self-defense. He wanted to tell them everything, even about the creature rising from beneath the floor, but every time he reached that part of the story, his voice cracked. The words felt too unreal, too strange, and he feared that if he said them out loud, people would think he had lost his mind. The sheriff listened with a stiff jaw, his face unreadable. He wrote down the hunter's words carefully, but there was doubt in his eyes. Elias' name had floated around the village for years, wrapped in rumors and warnings, yet no one had ever met him. Many believed they were long gone. Others thought they never existed at all. "You're saying you killed a man no one ever seen," the sheriff said slowly, "and left his body in a house no one ever found." The hunter swallowed hard. "I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you the truth." The sheriff tapped his pencil against the table. "And what about the other thing you mentioned?" The hunter hesitated. His hands trembled. "I don't know what it was, not human. It came from under the house." The sheriff sighed deeply and leaned back in his chair. He didn't say the hunter was lying, but he didn't say he believed him either. A search party went out that afternoon. The hunter insisted on joining them, even though fear knotted his stomach. He needed proof of what had happened. He needed them to see the place with their own eyes. He needed someone to believe him so he didn't carry the weight of it alone. But when they reached the part of the forest where he thought the clearing should be, nothing was there. The woods looked untouched. No broken fence, no path, no house, just endless trees stretching in every direction. The hunter felt his blood run cold. He retraced his steps again and again, heart pounding, certain he was close, but each time the forest led him somewhere different, somewhere wrong. The others exchanged uneasy glances. A few whispered that the hunter must have hallucinated, maybe from cold or exhaustion. The sheriff tried to stay neutral, but even he couldn't hide his skepticism. "You've been through a lot," the sheriff said quietly as they walked back. "Sometimes the mind fills in things that aren't there." The words stung. The hunter felt stripped of dignity, of truth. He knew what he'd seen. He knew what he'd fought. Yet now everyone looked at him with a sad, careful expression, as if he were fragile or confused. In the days that followed, the village settled back into its routines, but something had changed. People kept their distance from him, unsure what to believe. Some sympathized, thinking he had experienced a terrible trauma. Others whispered behind his back, saying he must have lost control and imagined a story to justify the violence. A few even hinted that perhaps he had killed someone else entirely, someone real, and invented the tale to cover it up. The guilt he carried grew heavier under their eyes. He replayed the fight with Elias again and again, wondering if he could have disarmed him instead, wondering if the terror in the moment had made him strike harder than he meant. At night, he woke drenched in sweat, hearing the echo of the creature's cry in his dreams. The villagers hesitated to enter the woods. Hunters traveled in pairs now, afraid of meeting the same fate. Parents warned their children not to wander near the trees. Rumors began to twist the story. Some claimed the hunter had been cursed, others said there were spirits who punished trespassers. The truth blurred under fear and gossip. The hunter's family tried to comfort him, but they saw the change in him. He grew quiet, withdrawn. He avoided the forest completely, unable to face the memories buried there. He felt both guilty and angry, guilty for killing Elias, angry that no one believed the danger still lurking in the woods. The sheriff made one final attempt to find evidence, but nothing turned up. No footprints, no remains, no sign a house had ever stood there. With nothing to go on, the case was quietly dropped. The official explanation was exhaustion, shock, and self-injury from wandering the forest overnight. Behind closed doors, the hunter heard people say things like, "He'll recover," or "He just needs rest." But he knew they didn't understand. He knew something in those woods was still alive. He felt it watching him when he walked near the tree line, felt it breathing in the cold air when the wind blew from the north. He swore he saw faint smoke rising between the trees some evenings, thin and pale like the smoke from the chimney. The fear never left him. It settled deeper with every day, a shadow he carried inside. He kept the pouch of bones locked in a box under his bed, unable to throw it away but terrified to touch it again. The sight of it alone made his stomach twist. It was the only proof left, and even he didn't fully understand what it meant. As winter settled in, the hunter stopped telling his story. He stopped trying to convince others. He learned to keep his fear to himself. But he felt the forest watching him, still waiting. And the silence of the village held its own kind of dread, as if deep down people sensed that something was wrong, even if they refused to say it out loud. His life had changed forever. The crime, the fight, the creature, they had taken something from him that he couldn't get back. And though the world around him tried to forget, he couldn't. Not when he still felt the cold breath of that hidden darkness following him through every quiet moment, not when he still woke in the night thinking he heard long fingers dragging across the floor. They were gone, but the fear remained. And deep in the forest, unseen by the village, something else remained too. The years that followed the tragedy at Hollow changed the people connected to it in ways none of them could have imagined. The case moved slowly at first, as the law tried to understand what exactly had happened out there in the woods that winter evening. Sheriff Denton spent weeks piecing together every detail he could, but even he admitted he had never seen anything like what began as a search for a missing hunter had grown into something far bigger, touching every corner of the community and forcing people to question things they used to believe were simple. Justice, guilt, and truth suddenly felt tangled, like the thick underbrush that had swallowed on that first night. Was the first to face the consequences. She didn't fight the arrest. She didn't curse or struggle. She simply lowered her eyes and let the deputies take her away. In the weeks that followed, she barely spoke to anyone. At times, she seemed confused, drifting between long silences and moments of strange clarity, as though she wasn't sure which version of her own story was real anymore. Some said she had been broken long before ever set foot on their land. Others believed something inside her finally cracked the night she struck him. In truth, it was likely both. The court found her guilty of manslaughter, not murder. They called it a crime born out of fear, emotional instability, and years of untreated trauma. She was sentenced to years in a state institution rather than prison. Even then, some argued she deserved worse. Others said she had already suffered more than anyone knew. Received a different fate. There was no physical evidence proving he had helped commit the crime, but there was enough to show he had helped hide it. And he wasn't the wide-eyed boy people once felt sorry for. As the investigation went on, people learned pieces of the truth he had kept tucked away his entire life. The control held over him, the way he followed her even when he knew she was slipping into darker thoughts. The years of waiting for a chance to be something other than the quiet shadow trailing behind a mother who clung too tightly. He tried to explain himself at the hearing, his voice shaking as he told the court he had only wanted to protect her, that she was all he had left, that by the time the truth confronted him, he was already in too deep to stop anything. The judge didn't show anger but disappointment, was sentenced to several years in prison for covering up the death. It wasn't just the crime that sealed his fate, but the choices he made afterward. The lies, the silence, the way he let panic lead him down a path even darker than the one had walked. By the time the sentence was read, looked drained, like someone who had finally understood the weight of the world he had helped create. He didn't cry as they took him away, but his face carried something heavier, quiet acceptance, mixed with a sadness that didn't seem like it would ever fade. As for the judgment came in a different form. His death shook the town, even those who barely knew him. People had looked up to him, some because he was brave, others because he lived in a way they wished they could. He was the kind of man who walked into the woods not to escape life, but to understand it. A man who believed that honesty should guide everything, even when it made things harder. When the truth of what happened to him spread through the county, it changed the way people talked about the woods, and even their own sense of safety. His family grieved not only for the loss itself, but for the way he had died. Alone, far from the people who loved him, in a place that swallowed him without mercy. Yet the deeper conversations came later, when the shock faded and people started thinking about what the case revealed. Some asked why no one had helped the sooner, long before fear and loneliness twisted them into shells of themselves. Others wondered whether the system had failed, too, ignoring the dangers hidden in places that looked harmless on the surface. There were debates about responsibility, how much belonged to, how much to, and how much to the complicated mix of circumstances that had shaped them. Nothing felt black and white anymore. People discovered that even tragedies had layers, and that sometimes the worst outcomes came from a lifetime of small, unseen breaks rather than one sudden choice. In the months that followed, the trial became a kind of mirror for the town. It forced people to think about justice not just as punishment, but as understanding. The judge's decisions were criticized by some who believed they had gotten off lightly. Others argued that true justice had to consider how a person becomes who they are, that a life shaped by fear and brokenness could lead to actions that were wrong but not born from pure cruelty. For the first time in years, the town confronted the complicated truth that people were not simply good or bad. They were shaped, harmed, influenced, cornered, and sometimes destroyed by forces they never learned how to fight. But the largest shift came from realizing how thin the line can be between safety and danger, love and control, protection and suffocation. Had loved too fiercely, so fiercely that she smothered him under the weight of her fears. Had loved her too blindly, following her even when her choices pushed them toward ruin. Had loved the quiet of the woods so deeply that he ignored the warnings that something felt off that night. Their lives had all collided in a moment that none of them could undo. By the end of the year, the house stood empty. The front door was boarded up. The windows were covered in dust. Hunters avoided that part of the forest, not because of ghosts or stories, but because it reminded them how quickly a place could turn from home to battlefield. The smell of damp would still hung in the air, and sometimes, when the wind moved just right, it sounded like the house exhaled, a long, tired breath from a place that had seen too much. People visited its grave often, leaving small items, spent cartridges, folded notes no one else was allowed to read. His family tried to move forward, but grief is strange. It doesn't leave, it just settles into the corners of your life. It becomes something you learn to carry. They told stories about him at the dinner table, making sure his name stayed alive in the place he loved. Some years later, a small hiking trail near the edge of the forest was named after him. It was a quiet tribute, but a meaningful one. Shepherd's Creek didn't forget him. As for the years inside, changed him. Guards said he spent most of his time reading or sitting alone. He didn't make trouble. He didn't speak much. When he was finally released, he didn't return to Hollow. He moved across the state, taking small jobs, living in rented rooms, and trying to build a life without the shadows of his past. Some said they saw him at a bus station one winter, older, thinner, but with a softer look in his eyes, as if he was learning how to breathe again. No one knows if he found peace, but he learned something many people never do. That guilt doesn't fade, but it can be lived with if a person is willing to face it. Remained in the institution, drifting between moments of clarity and long stretches of silence. Her mind had become a maze she couldn't escape. Nurses said she spent her afternoons staring at the trees outside her window, as though she was still watching the forest for dangers that were no longer there. Some believed she never fully understood the chain of events she set into motion. Others said she understood too well, and that was why she rarely spoke. In her final years, she no longer mentioned or the woods. It was as if her memories had folded inward, leaving only fragments of a life filled with fear, love, and pain. When people looked back on the case years later, they didn't talk just about the crime. They talked about what it revealed, the cracks in people, the pressure of isolation, the danger of unspoken fears. The story became something parents told their children not to scare them, but to remind them to reach out, to speak up, to check on the quiet houses at the edge of town. They said they weren't monsters. They were reminders of what happens when pain goes untreated and fear goes unnoticed. In the end, justice came in many forms, Courts passed sentences. Families grieved. The town learned. But the deepest justice came from understanding the lesson hidden beneath the tragedy, that human beings are fragile, shaped by every moment of kindness and every moment of neglect. That power, fear, and love can twist together until no one can tell one from the other. And that sometimes the scariest stories are not about evil, but about people who were never taught how to survive their own darkness. The woods eventually grew quiet again. New hunters walked the trails. New families moved into the valley. Life continued the way it always does. But those who remembered the story carried a small piece of it wherever they went, a reminder that danger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hides in silence. Sometimes it grows behind closed doors. Sometimes it starts with love. And sometimes, all it takes to change the course of several lives is a single man losing his way at dusk.